4 presidents now in charge. I was number 5 is in charge. I was number 3. So I talk to these people anytime, right? To leaders, and I say, we're going to waste our time here. If people are serious, just come and talk, and nothing happens. Sometimes it makes sense. When they should be moving this way, they make sense without us knowing in the United Nations. So let's be serious. If we want to get rid of this terrible weapon, let's do it. We mean it. Let's mean what we say and say what we mean. And so we're struggling. We want this to be achieved. Hopefully in my lifetime, hopefully while I'm here, a lot of things will move forward. And I'm doing my best with the help of good people like Christian, who's working in an NGO, but also helping me. And Kazakhstan, the Jungle League, an expert from Kazakhstan, I enjoy. These 2 guys always throwing me great ideas. And they make me move forward to talk with those ambassadors in the other countries. And I know many of those ambassadors don't like me. They don't like the idea, but I don't care. This is good for humanity, good for everybody. Let's get rid of all this nonsense. Making weapons. Weapons for what? To destroy other people's lives? That's nonsense. Let's continue to make bread, donuts, and that's food. Catch fish, plant, plant more crops, and feed the world with nice, lovely food. And let's stop reducing, and let's make production industries on those things. But not industries to make weapons to kill other people. That's a nonsense today. That's outdated. That belongs to many centuries back. I've been reading history, and that's what they did in those. Our ancestors were not that clever. The word was clever, but I don't know whether we are clever or much sillier now with what we're doing. So I leave it at that. You now know why Keith is there, why I'm here, why I'm here in this. And thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you for this great gathering of great people. Thank you.
So next we will hear from Simran, who's a counselor from the mission of Kazakhstan. He has a law degree from the Kazakh State Law University and his master's at King's College from the War Studies Department. He's been working in the foreign ministry since 2003 and has 8 years of experience in disarmament and non-proliferation sphere. His previous position was the head of disarmament and non-proliferation division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he's an active co-chair of the working group on Articles 6 and 7 with the Tibetans.
Thank you very much, Christian. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to share today's panel with such esteemed and distinguished colleagues. First of all, Ambassador Sito and Veronique from ICRC, Dr. Nikolic, of course Christian, who is the right hand of the ambassador, and my dear colleagues from Mexico, Malaysia, South Africa, Chile, and Taiwan, and also we online in our connection with Bonnie, who is another pillar of our working group. And let me first ask you whether you know my country, Kazakhstan, because I noticed not many people in this city are aware where Kazakhstan is situated. Please raise your hand who is not aware. So many people at this top university, of course, are familiar with Kazakhstan. It's one of the post-Soviet countries situated in Central Asia, in the heart of Eurasia, and sharing its border with Russia, China, 3 Central Asia states, and on the Caspian Sea with Azerbaijan and Iran. So my country gained independence in 1991 on the 16th of December, and 3 months before that we had a brave decision to close the nuclear testing site Do you know how many types of weapons of mass destruction exist in the world? Do you know? So there are 3 types of weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons that may kill not just 1 or dozen of people, it may kill million or maybe hundreds of millions of people, and like it was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when more than 100,000 people died simultaneously. So this is one of the types of weapons of mass destruction, which is nuclear weapons. We have also chemical and biological, and all of these types of weapons were tested in my country during the Cold War. And of course, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, my country decided to get rid of these weapons. And since that time, it's been a priority of our foreign policy that we pursue such a policy of convincing other countries to do the same, to follow our example. Now, in my country, we don't have any types of weapons of mass destruction, and owing to our partners, the Russian Federation, the United States of America, we were able to remove all the nuclear weapons arsenal from our territory, and became a party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear weapons possessing state. And of course, we try to solve possible mistakes in the future, but we left with the legacy of nuclear testing. And for a period over around 40 years, 456, it's 456 nuclear tests were carried out on the territory of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. And that affected such a mortality and morbidity of the local population. And roughly 1.5 million people were affected and still suffer of the radioactive contamination. And that is why my country is interested in abolishing nuclear weapons. And we've been closely working with Kiribati on co-chairing the working group, Article 6 and 7, which is in charge of positive obligations, as just mentioned by our distinguished ambassador. This is on the victim assistance and the environmental remediation. So if we talk about victim assistance, we need to provide necessary aid to the people who were suffered, local communities, we call them affected communities. And the other problem is to remediate the contaminated, polluted areas, environment. So you can probably see during our next speeches, next presentations, that it's not just Kazakhstan. There have been other places in the world where people still suffer. One of them is the Pacific Ocean region, and Kiribati is one of them, where 39 nuclear tests were carried out by the United States and United Kingdom. In my country, it was Soviet testing, and there are some other parts of the world, and still some of them are not state party to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So if we have chemical, biological weapons totally prohibited by the relevant respective conventions, now we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but still is not universal. And of course, we don't have any universal treaties in the field of disarmament and non-proliferation, but our aim is to have as much as possible countries joining us. And this is our work, together with all of these people sitting here. Of course, I could talk more, but other colleagues would need also to give their presentations. Once again, thank you very much, and I'm happy to participate in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Bonnie, are you free to hear us?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you turn on the video? Okay. See you. Good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, so next, thank you so much, Jean Galvin. So next we will hear from Bonnie Doherty, the director of the Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection Initiative and lecturer in law at the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. She is also a senior researcher in the Arms Division of Human Rights Watch. Doherty specializes in disarmament and international humanitarian law, particularly as they relate to civilian protection during armed conflict. Doherty has worked in the field of humanitarian disarmament since 2001 as a lawyer, field researcher, and scholar. She played a key role in the negotiations with the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, successfully advocating for specific provisions and providing legal advice to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICAN. So without further ado, I would like to invite Bonnie to give her presentation, please.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you to the organizers, Nuclear Peace Foundation, ICANN, and many of the other organizers, and thanks to all of you for bearing with me for not being there in New York and having to put up with the technological difficulties. I appreciate that. So Jean-Guy mentioned the positive obligations, and I want to focus on a specific element of how those are being implemented. And one of the most commonly discussed issues since the adoption of the treaty, and particularly over the past year, has been the idea of a trust fund for Articles 6 and 7. The Vienna Action Plan, which was adopted last summer, which is a document produced at the first meeting of states parties and lays out steps that states have agreed to take to implement the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Vienna Action Plan calls on countries to discuss the feasibility of and propose guidelines for such a trust fund. And the trust fund could advance the humanitarian goals of the treaty by funding programs to assist victims and take steps to remediate the environment. And in so doing, it could help them, both affected states parties, meet their Article 6 obligations, which Jean-Guy just discussed, as well as help states parties meet their Article 7 obligations, because donating money to the fund would be one way to fulfill their international cooperation and assistance. I'll lay out 7 key elements of trust funds and make some recommendations for what a TPNW trust fund could look like. Recommendations drawn, I won't get all the details, but drawn precedent from 10 existing trust funds in disarmament, human rights, and international criminal law that we did a study of at Harvard Law School. And generally aligned with those of ICANN, who's also published on the topic. So the first question is, who should be eligible to contribute? And trust funds we looked at allow contributions from various combinations of actors. And we believe, given that the TPNW is a humanitarian treaty, that they should maximize the donor pool. So trust funds generally accept contributions from countries, and it is a given that TPNW states parties should be among the contributors. And by states parties, I'm referring to countries that have ratified the treaty. There may be some reluctance to allow other countries to contribute, but increasing the resources for victim assistance and environmental remediation is important. And in addition, engaging these countries in the work of the TPNW could increase their motivation to join. A TPNW trust fund, like other such funds, would also welcome contributions, even if they're modest in size, from non-state actors such as international organizations like the UN or others, NGOs, the private sector, and individuals. The second element is who should make distribution decisions. Building on precedent, we recommend the TPNW Trust Fund rely on a board of trustees or some sort of comparable committee to determine how funds are distributed. The board should be diverse geographically as well as in gender, and should consist of a mixed group of actors. Specifically, it should include representatives of states parties, independent experts in law, culture, science, etc., and most importantly, representatives of affected communities who've been who can speak to their specific experience that needs to be addressed by victim assistance and environmental remediation. The third issue is who should be eligible to receive funding. Existing trust funds award grants to states, non-state actors, or on occasion victims directly. And we would recommend a mixed approach for the TPNW Trust Fund. In other words, funding state and non-state actors, such as, again, UN agencies, nonprofit organizations, etc. Nevertheless, given that the fund will likely have limited resources at the outset, some prioritization may make sense. In particular, the fund could choose to prioritize assistance to states parties and organizations with projects in states parties in the early years and consider extending access to the fund to states outside of the treaty and organizations working in those states over time. Fourth and fifth elements would be what kinds of projects should be funded and for how long. We identified 3 categories of projects in existing trust funds and think that the TPNW fund should follow those because they really align with the Article 6 and 7 Article 6 obligations that Jen Gully mentioned. There should be capacity building projects that would cover things like developing a national plan for engaging in deposit obligations for trainings and workshops, things like that. There should be funding for victim assistance projects that would assist with healthcare, would ensure socioeconomic inclusion for affected individuals, would advance victims' human rights. And there should be assistance for environmental remediation projects that support different stages of the process, from assessment to containment and treatment of contamination, removal and transport to long-term storage. And also in this category, there should be programs for educating people about the risk of contamination and hosting warnings, things like that. Given that both victim assistance and environmental remediation in the nuclear weapons context in particular are endeavors that may be needed for decades or even centuries, we believe that the TPNW Trust Fund should have the flexibility regarding the length and size of grants. 6, what mechanisms should be used for reporting and accountability? Most trust funds impose accountability measures on grant recipients and/or fund managers, and the TPNW Trust Fund should certainly do both. Those reports should be transparent, increase the accountability, but at the same time, they should be non-burdensome and only require the information necessary to guarantee appropriate use of the funds. And finally, there's questions about what administrative measures should be adopted. So, for example, states parties will need to decide on whether to create an independent ad hoc secretariat or something within an existing entity of the UN and how funding will work. We didn't study those issues in depth, so I won't delve into them here. In conclusion, obviously we could go on late about to just touch on the highlights, but in conclusion, while I focused on the substance of a trust fund's design, I also want to emphasize that the process behind the design is also important. Its impact will be enhanced if the process to develop it is an inclusive one, and in particular, members of affected communities should be meaningfully involved. Those communities, like I said, have suffered from the use and testing of nuclear weapons, and they have a unique understanding of what effects are that need to be addressed and how to best address them. And ultimately, the success of the trust fund will depend on the initiative and engagement of the partnership of states, parties, affected communities, civil society groups, international organizations, and other stakeholders, many of whom have been invited here to speak today. So I'm excited to be part of this panel. I'm happy to answer questions later in the program. So thank you very much for your indulgence with the tech issues, and thank you, Christian, for your helping out with that.
Yes, thank you so much, Rami, for your comments regarding the International Trust Fund. So now we're going to move towards the other topic, which is on the It's okay. So next we're going to have a discussion on universalization of the TPNW, and our two speakers are Mr. Yassine Moukran, who is the first secretary of the mission of South Africa. And then we will hear from Mr. Shulan sorry. apologies, to the Second Secretary from the Prohibition of Malaysia. So I would like to welcome Nancy, please.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I'd like to thank, obviously, the organizers for having us here today. Yes, my name is Yasin Lahadin. I'm from a small country in South Africa. South Africa is located, guess where? It's in the name. And it's actually quite strange how many times I've been asked that. And it's actually even stranger how we can't even point it on a map. So anyway, I feel the pain of Kazakhstan. And, but I'm very happy to be here to talk to you guys. You know, the way we were sort of asked to speak to you was a little bit difficult for me, because usually we like to speak to diplomats and we like to jump straight into the technical matters. So I really needed to orientate myself. How do I approach this? And I am going to approach it from a way that tries to bring everyone along. Universalization of the TPNW. Why the TPNW? Well, firstly, we have to talk about the NPT. So the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was the way that the world tried to address the issue of nuclear weapons. What it was born out of in the it came into effect in 1970, and the NPT stands on 3 pillars. So the whole problem was, how do we address the problem of the proliferation of nuclear weapons? We knew that you had states that had nuclear weapons. I think the cutoff date was 1967, that you would be recognized as a nuclear weapons state. So you have the 5 nuclear weapons states. You have the US, France, the UK, Russia, and China. These are kind of legally recognized nuclear weapons states. So they are the ones allowed to have nuclear weapons states under the NPT. So the problem they had was, how do we prevent others from getting nuclear weapons? So they designed the treaty, the NPT, in a way that it could preclude others from getting nuclear weapons. So the 3 pillars of the NPT includes nuclear disarmament. They would agree to disarm at some point in time, get rid of the nuclear weapons. The second was non-proliferation. So all those that don't have nuclear weapons should not acquire the nuclear weapons. And the third pillar is the peaceful uses of nuclear weapons, so atoms for peace, basically. So you're allowed to use these nuclear weapons for peaceful purposes. The challenge is that 1970 was a long time ago, and over 50 years have gone by, and there is still no nuclear disarmament. So we have what is traditionally called nuclear apartheid, which is apt coming from a South African, but it basically means you have the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots. However, born out of frustration, out of the failure of the 2015 NPT review conference, that's to review the treaty on the NPT, the TPNW was born, in the sense that member states decided they need to have discussions on a different approach to the issue of nuclear weapons. So, you know, discussions began in 2015, and in 2017 the treaty actually went into was sort of agreed on, and it went into effect in the 2020, I think, yeah, 2021. Yes, January. And that's after 50 states ratified the TPNW. What's different from the TPNW? TPNW bans nuclear weapons outright. So there is no nuclear apartheid under the TPNW. What the TPNW says is it is illegal to have nuclear weapons. And this was not born out of the idea to curtail the proliferation of nuclear weapons, but it was born out of the idea of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. So understanding that the use of nuclear weapons would be catastrophic. So this understanding is really what underpins the TPNW. So it's a humanitarian-based treaty under the full understanding of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And this is why, you know, the TPNW is so important, and why it's so different, because it bans nuclear weapons outright. Okay, so now I can get into universalization. So after the first meeting of states parties that took place last year in Vienna, there was a decision that we would set up an intercessional structure. Because the treaty is young, we need to establish a process of how to implement the treaty. There are various questions that emanate from the treaty. So the intercessional structure was set up. And Malaysia and South Africa was charged with the Article 12 priority, which means Article 12 says that every state has to campaign to make sure that the treaty is universalized. So basically encouraging others to sign on to the treaty. So this is where we are. So South Africa was charged, and Malaysia was charged with this responsibility to coordinate the efforts of all states parties to universalize, to promote the treaty, to encourage others to sign on. So that was one of the decisions. And the first meeting of states parties also produced a Vienna action plan. The Vienna action plan has around 50 action points of what needs to happen to try and realize the implementation of the TPNW. So the first action points focus on universalization. There are 14 of them. I won't go through all 14 of them, but what I will say is that they include measures such as making universalization a priority for all states parties, fulfilling Article 12, sharing of information to facilitate accession to the treaty, commissioning of studies and publications to promote the case for the treaty, garnering support for the GA resolutions concerning the treaty and its underpinnings, and raising awareness in general, and then there are 14 in total. So what we have done so far as Malaysia and South Africa is we put together a framework or a program of action for all states parties to participate in this universalization process. Of course, it's the responsibility of all states parties to the TPNW to promote its universalization. But I thought for our purposes, we also thought to lead by example. So in January this year, South Africa had a conference and workshop which was organized along with the ICRC and the ICANN to actually get African states to understand what is required for the signing and ratification of the treaty, how important the treaty is, because Africa, for example, has a nuclear weapons-free zone. So there's a lot of commitment to the idea of a nuclear-free Africa and a nuclear-free world, but of course, the commitment needs to be followed by signing and ratification and being part of the treaty process. So that's the work that we've been doing. We have very positive partners, very strong partners actually, ICANN and the ICRC. It being a humanitarian-based treaty, of course, it's important to have these partners, especially the ICRC, who help us quite a lot in terms of the legal aspects of the treaty and the humanitarian underpinnings. So in the current status of the treaty, I think we have ratified 68 countries or states parties. They are full states parties of the treaty. And there's additional 27 that have signed. So it brings the total sessions and actions, legal actions of the treaty to around 95. So in order to reach a majority, it would have to reach 99 member states to be the majority of member states or states parties or potential states parties in the world. So it's quite important for us, and it's been one of the goals of the intercessional period between the first and the second meeting of states parties to get at least this critical mass of the majority of the world signing onto the treaty. What's unique about the TPNW is that the treaty can enter into force, which it has done, but you don't need to jump straight into a seat of the treaty. You can sign it, so give up your political will, and then also follow through in the ratification process. So it shows that there is space to commit to the treaty without having to have that full commitment from the start. So it's quite important for us to have that provision in the treaty so we can do this work on universalization and encourage others to sign up. So before I hand over to my fellow co-chair, Shivanand from Malaysia, I just want to make one more point. You know, the issue of nuclear weapons is a major challenge because it's one of the existential threats to humanity. I mean, many people focus on climate change at this point in time, the pandemic, it's quite real. But I think for us, the nuclear threat has really receded into the background. And so, for example, I had a privilege to have a discussion in Vienna last week with Nina Tenenwald. She's quite a prominent figure in the academic circles. Her book, Nuclear Taboo, is something that I would recommend. And it really speaks about the taboo against the use of nuclear weapons. And what she said, it was quite important for the TPNW purposes, was that the nuclear taboo finds its institutional home in the TPNW. So it is, the TPNW gives legal effect to the idea of the nuclear taboo. And what was important to mention about the nuclear taboo is because there's always been a groundswell of movements and that sort of thing against nuclear weapons, but it has receded into the background because of, it seems like we can't deal with so many existential threats at the same time. So we tend to forget those long-standing ones, and nuclear weapons is such an existential threat. And it's actually something that we can do something about, like, almost immediately. So I think that we want to just emphasize that the TPNW is really an effort to bring this back into the mindsets of the public, and also to try and really address the threat of nuclear weapons. And I think we are getting to that point. I mean, moral, legal, ethical, humanitarian, and strategic dimensions of having nuclear weapons is quickly diminishing. And so we need to be strong and keep pushing for that. So thank you very much.
So much. Next, we'll hear Shilama, who is the Second Secretary of the Mission of Malaysia.
Thank you very much, Christian. At the outset, may I take this opportunity to thank the organizers for inviting Malaysia to participate in this dialogue. I really like the way my colleague Yassin has set the stage for us, as it were. And precisely as he said, all too often it seems like much of the discourse, dialogue on nuclear weapons and what we can do to eliminate them takes place in diplomatic corridors, among officials and experts, and it's critical when we look at universalization to broaden that and to hear perspectives not only from our partners in civil society, but also from students, from youth, and from publics at large, because only then can we create the groundswell of support that we need in order to realize a world free of nuclear weapons. And we've seen with COVID-19, over 6.8 million lives lost, immense socioeconomic disruption, and as Yassin also mentioned earlier, perhaps with all that's happening in the world, the the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons to all of humanity has somewhat receded. And this is precisely why it is so critical for us, especially as members of the TPNW Coordination Committee, to keep not just the treaty itself in the spotlight, but the overarching goal that it represents. Yassin also touched on the NPT and how it has a clear distinction between the 5 nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, and how the TPNW differs in the sense that there isn't that distinction, and that it prohibits nuclear weapons as a class. For us as non-nuclear weapon states, parties to the NPT and states parties to the TPNW, we see the TPNW as fully complementary to and compatible with the NPT, and it's a concrete means of advancing nuclear disarmament. Well, this is a recurring debate which we see very often at various fora, including at the UN, of course. Questions such as the extent to which the NPT has fulfilled its promise, the status of that grand bargain between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, and where we are as a global community vis-a-vis nuclear disarmament. So it's in that context that the TPNW has emerged as a really groundbreaking instrument. And as South Africa and others have mentioned, we are currently at 68 states parties. So in order for us to move forward, we have a target of achieving half of all states in the world. And that's where it's not just about the numbers, right? Because what we really need is to shift narratives at various levels. And to influence real change, you're going to need public support that is sustainable. And this is where it has been very heartening to see efforts on the part of TPNW states parties to shift what the narratives in terms of what the role of this treaty is, what it can achieve, and why it is so relevant and significant given what we see unfolding with increased nuclear rhetoric, nuclear threats, international tensions, and it's in that context that we feel we have to really push forward. The vivid testimony of victims of nuclear weapon use and testing and their descendants also remind us of the unspeakable humanitarian consequences of these abhorrent instruments of war. And this is where we also have a working group co-chaired by Kazakhstan and Kiribati. We heard from the distinguished ambassador of Kiribati and Kazakhstan earlier on what's being done on that front. And that is where the intersessional process of the TPNW also comes in, to take forward different work streams, and we'll hear later from other colleagues on different aspects of their work. So, like my colleague from South Africa said earlier, for the universalization working group, it's a lot of advocacy, really trying to spread the message and dispel any misconceptions surrounding the treaty. And that's a collective obligation that all TPNW states parties share. And this is also why we feel it's really critical to keep the dialogue going, and I'd love to hear any ideas on initiatives that we can consider as well, relating to how we can strengthen this message on nuclear disarmament, specifically through the TPNW. I just want to touch briefly also on another aspect of this, which is nuclear weapon-free zones. As we move towards really making the entire world a nuclear weapon-free zone, these established zones will also play an important role. And in Southeast Asia, where my country, Malaysia, is, we do have a nuclear weapon-free zone, but the protocol has yet to be signed by any of the nuclear weapon states. So there are still discussions among ASEAN member states in that regard. And one point that TPNW states parties have been at pains to emphasize is that everything that we're doing is in support of the global disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. We all recognize that the NPT remains the cornerstone of that regime, but we see the TPNW as an extremely valuable component, and we're all invested in taking it forward. So thank you again to the organizers, and looking forward to our discussion as well.
Thank you so much. So now we will hear from Seth Shelton, the United Nations liaison for the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, a 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning coalition working to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. In this capacity, he assists governments in signing and ratifying the TPNW and represents ICAN in promoting universalization and implementation of the treaty.
Thank you, Christian. Thanks everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you and to be here with these really esteemed colleagues, because you are hearing from the group that's really represents the states that are behind this treaty, that are leading it and leading us to a world free of nuclear weapons. So it's quite a cool group that we've assembled for this, I think. And you know, I'm going to talk about civil society. And this is also the part where we can talk about how you can get involved too. And well, how many of you knew what this treaty was before you came in the room tonight, actually? That's a good starting question. Okay, so most, not all. How many of you knew about ICAN before? Half, most, maybe. Okay, well that's good, and I thank Yassine as well for giving us some overview about the treaty. That does some work for us. You know, I'm here to talk to you about how you can get involved and also why you must get involved, I'm afraid. You know, like climate change, nuclear weapons represent the great existential threat to our future, the future of humanity. It's like climate change, it's a problem that's been created by humans. Like climate change, it's a problem that's only in the hands of humans to solve. And unfortunately, like climate change, it's going to affect most the people who had nothing to do with creating it, including you as young people. And it's a problem that's just getting passed on to you to solve, which is a crap deal. But today we're going to make the case that through this treaty, you now have something, we all have something that we can use to get there. Okay, let me tell you a bit about ICANN for the half of you that don't know. We are a coalition of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We're right now 652 NGOs in 110 countries, but we're always growing. And we're credited as being sort of the coalition that's the leading voice behind and the leading advocates behind the TPNW. In 2017, we won the Nobel Peace Prize, which I actually brought with me in case anyone wants to take a picture with it or something. We were awarded the prize for our work to draw attention to the humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, as well as for our work in advocating to bring about the TPNW. But we, when I say we, you know, we are more than just these organizations. We're really trying to represent everyone, including the people who came before us. I mean, we stand on the shoulders of decades of advocates who have always wanted this. Civil society has, for forever, since 1945, spoken loudly about its opposition to further use, development, testing of nuclear weapons. Civil society largely has always overwhelmingly supported a prohibition treaty. Obviously there are exceptions, and we can talk a lot about why there are voices in our communities who speak about deterrence as if it's keeping us safe, and it's our job to help break that down, because it's a fallacy that a lot of us have been sold, and it makes no sense. But let me focus first, at least, on the fact that this is something that the will of the people has always been behind, and yet it's taken so long even to get the text of this treaty adopted. We didn't have a treaty until 2017. So why has that happened? Who stands in the way? Why don't we bow to the will of the majority of the world? And that's a story of marginalization. That's a story of how the most affected people, the people who suffer the most, have the least voice. That's a story being told by the victims. We've heard from affected states just now in Kiribati in Kazakhstan. That's a story told by states. You know, the vast majority of the countries in the world have wanted this, and it's taken so long to come about. I mean, I thank Yassine for giving us the phrase. I mean, it could be spoken no more powerfully than South Africa, nuclear apartheid. The fact that a small group and a small number of states control the destiny of, and basically give no others a say in the resolution of this great problem. But the idea for this treaty came about by those convinced that there was a way to make progress even before those possessor states would be part of it. And the blueprint for this, by the way, was laid out. We're also standing on the shoulders of those who have worked on other disarmament treaties in what we call a movement termed humanitarian disarmament. We've heard a bit about it. Some of the states here are leaders in other humanitarian disarmament treaties. Professor Doherty, who we just heard from, has also been a big part of some of these other humanitarian disarmament treaties. And the concept here was that if we reframe the discussion from one focused on state security to one focused about human security, we can push from those states that already are on board, again, the majority of the world, to then marginalize the possessors, to flip the script a bit. And it was successful with the Mine Ban Treaty, with the Cluster Munitions Convention, and it's been very successful in basically changing the way we achieve disarmament, right? Let's get the supporters on first, and then, and then basically ostracize, stigmatize, and marginalize those possessor states. After all, they're a great minority. And also by doing that, we see how we can reframe who is the voices that we listen to. If you frame everything in terms of state security, then the only voices that matter are going to be, the military strategists or the arms dealers. But once you start reframing things in terms of human security, then you tell the story of what nuclear weapons or any of these weapons do to human bodies, to the environment. And then the people who are the leading voices become the scientists, the climatologists, the doctors who know what a nuclear weapon does to a physical body. And of course, perhaps most of all, the affected people, the people who have experienced what nuclear weapons do personally, firsthand. And that's something that ICANN means to advance, works very closely with the International Committee of the Red Cross. You'll hear from Veronique soon. That's the work that we all do together to tell this different story. I mean, I hope if we can do anything today, and Shivanon was just talking about, like, our goal in universalizing the treaty is also not just to get states on board, but to convince people like you and your friends and your family that this is an imperative. And part of that, I think, is for you to walk out of this room and never let a conversation happen again where people talk about nuclear weapons or whether or not they'll be used in Ukraine, or whether or not they keep you safe, without having that conversation focus in part on what nuclear weapons will actually do to people, to bodies, to the environment. The blast that would destroy everything for hundreds of miles away, the heat that burns hotter than the sun from a nuclear weapon, the electromagnetic pulse that would obliterate infrastructure, communications infrastructure, everything that society has spent generations to build, the radioactive effect that would transcend generations. You'll have heard this past year, in the context of the war in Ukraine, people talking about, like, the will they or won't they sort of discussion, and the possibility that Russia might use small nuclear weapons in the context of Ukraine. That's another thing you could walk out of here with a different perspective on. I mean, there are no such things as small nuclear weapons. The bombs dropped, that the US dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 15 and 21 kilotons respectively, are dwarfed in, they make those weapons look like ancient technology compared to the ones that have been developed since the hydrogen bomb tests. And the bombs that are in arsenals now are hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs that the US dropped over Japan. Meaning that when people are talking about small nuclear weapons in the current conflicts, they're talking about bombs that were basically on the order of magnitude of what was dropped in Japan. So just keep that in mind. And it's amazing that we have to tell that story. These are basic facts, but yet we see a media narrative that sort of just forgets it so often. One other thing, perhaps. Tell me I'm doing time. No, tell me. Is that okay? And there's the climate connection too. We have this. Those of us working in climate risks should understand that nuclear weapons represent the most acute risk to the climate that's even conceivable. Acute in the sense that climate change is on a longer time scale, not long enough, but nuclear weapons threaten to exacerbate the climate crisis instantaneously and exponentially. I'm sure that some of you have heard the phrase like nuclear winter. What does that even mean? What we're talking about with nuclear winter is the concept that in the event of the use of nuclear weapons over a populated area or an industrialized area, the amount of soot and debris that would be lofted into the upper atmosphere beyond the reach of precipitation would be such that it would black out the sun and cause global cooling. Now, recent research, in fact a study performed last year, shows that the effect of nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons over this populated area would lead to famine that would affect people way outside of the territory of where nuclear weapons were used in a way that the study concludes, and this is horrifying to contemplate, but it was basically looking at two different models. One was an exchange of nuclear weapons between India and Pakistan, the other US and Russia. In the former case, they conclude that up to 2 billion people died in a war between India and Pakistan, and that in the, God forbid, a war between the US and Russia, up to 5 billion people. So basically almost all humanity would die due to the climactic effects and the results on food supply and caloric output, basically. So one more thing you could walk out of with a new perspective on too is when people talk about how many times nuclear weapons have been used. I mean, everyone, it seems, so many people anyways, will talk about the weapons used over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think after hearing from Kiribati and Kazakhstan, you should realize that nuclear weapons have not been used just twice. There have been over 2,000 nuclear weapons tests that have obliterated societies, that have destroyed both land and people, and that people don't talk about nearly enough, including, the future harm that would, the past harm, because this TPNW, what we're talking about is not only preventing nuclear weapons from being used again, but also addressing the past harm, and that's what we heard about initially. We have affected people here in New York City, I should know. We have people who have been, many people don't realize, but the Manhattan Project, where nuclear weapons were created, was named because they began in Manhattan. And in fact, here at Columbia University was a site of nuclear weapons research before and during the Manhattan Project. There were approximately 700 people, I understand, who were working on it. Even the football team was recruited to move vats of uranium around. And there are affected communities throughout New York City. There are, if you're familiar with the concept of Superfund sites, where the EPA is basically trying to remediate environmentally damaged sites. There are 3 of them in New York City. 2 of them relate to nuclear weapons and the Manhattan Project, and some of them are still being remediated. So I'll leave you with what you can do. You can check out ICANN, you can read about the treaty, talk about nuclear weapons in perhaps a different way. We have so many initiatives through ICANN that we can point you to. We have the Cities Appeal, where we have cities that are in nuclear armed states and nuclear complicit states, meaning states that are part of the so-called nuclear umbrella, that have said, that have adopted declarations saying that even though our federal government, our national government opposes the TPNW, we, the majority of citizens in our cities, and after all, it's nuclear weapons are targeting cities, not militaries, we believe that our country should join the TPNW. We have the legislative pledge, so if you have a congressperson, they should join it and say that they support the treaty. We have divestment initiatives. We have university initiatives. I encourage you to check out a report called Schools of Mass Destruction, focused on the schools that are most involved in nuclear weapons production, the jobs pipeline, investments, not as much in Columbia University today, I should say. Thankfully, they're not called out as much, but there are a lot of them that are, in the US in particular. Yeah, join us. Follow #NuclearBan, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Seth. So next we will hear from Veronique Ristori, the Senior Arms Advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross Delegation to the United Nations. Since 1997, she's promoted and developed laws regulating the use of weapons, including conventional and nuclear weapons, as well as new technologies such as autonomous weapon systems and cyber warfare. She's participated in all the negotiations related to the weapons issues at the United Nations in the last 2 decades, notably the Arms Trade Treaty, all the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conferences since 2000, as well as the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, in 2017. So please.
delighted to be with you. I'm very honored. And I will be happy to answer your question. Yes, I'm very honored because I was part of the negotiator of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So happy to discuss about this historic achievement. Thank you, Columbia University, and Dr. Ivana Yu, of the director of the Nuclear Peace Age Foundation, to welcoming us. I think that it's very important that we have a conversation about nuclear weapons. I would like to say a few words about the International Committee of the Red Cross. This year we are celebrating the 160th anniversary of the ICRC. It's the largest humanitarian organization, and our mandate is to assist and protect people affected by armed conflict. And we have also another mandate. We are the guardian of international humanitarian law, and as we are law students, I think that it's very important that we can also have a conversation on international humanitarian law. As you know, Switzerland is the depository of the Geneva Convention and the additional protocol of 1977. And what is also wanted to mention is that the ICRC flag is the reverse of the Swiss flag, and it's also an honor because we are a Swiss organization working in 80 armed conflict. And just to have an idea, our budget is 2.3 billion, and it's 1 day of the US military budget. So I would like to just put things in perspective. I would like also to begin by reading a quick quote of Dr. Marcel Junot of the ICRC. Was a doctor, and he was one of the first foreign witness of the use of nuclear weapons. So I just wanted to read this sentence because I think that it's important that we put things in perspective. In a few seconds, thousands of human beings in the street and garden in the town center, struck by a wave of intense heat, died like flies. Others left waiting like worms, atrociously burned. All private house, warehouse, disappeared as it swept away by a supernatural power. Unquote. So the ICRC witnessed firsthand the horror and suffering in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With doctor, nurse, and the Japanese Red Cross, they tried in near impossible conditions to assist the dying and injured. Hospitals were in ruins. There were no medicine, no bandage, no blood transfusion. Of 1,000 patients were taken refuge to the Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital on the first day, 600 died rapidly. And I think that it's also important to put things in perspective as there is this narrative on nuclear weapons, and as mentioned, that the tactical use of nuclear weapons, that it's the size of the bomb that they were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also in the perspective that we just got over from COVID, to have an idea that 80% of the doctor and 90% of the nurse were killed in Nagasaki. Dr. Junot wrote, "The physical impact of the bomb was beyond belief, beyond all apprehension, beyond imagination. Its moral impact was appalling." And I mean, if you have an opportunity to go to Japan, please go to the memorial, either in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to go to the museum. And what is striking is not what you see, it's what you don't see. And to witness the walls where you have the shadows of people that printed in the wall, that they were vaporized, I think it really puts you, what does it mean, the use of nuclear weapons? Furthermore, as you may know, in Japan and in other parts where there were nuclear testing, the people, they are still suffering, 7 decades ago, from the impact of nuclear weapons. So not only they suffer during the attack, but when you are 70, years later, you're still suffering, and then the generation and the generation after are just still suffering from an impact of weapon. You are really thinking about our humanity. In September 1945, the ICRC made the first call for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. So you see, we were not very successful until 2017. So why it is so important to focus on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons? Because they are the benchmark against which the moral, ethical, and legal acceptability of a weapon is to be judged. In the ICRC view, it's extremely doubtful that nuclear weapons could ever be used in accordance with the principle and rule of international humanitarian law. And as you may know, the three principles of international humanitarian law is the distinction between civilian and combatant, the proportionality of the attack, and the prohibition of inflicting unnecessary suffering. Moreover, the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is aberrant to the principle of humanity and dictate of public conscience. The conflict in Ukraine and the alarming risk of use of nuclear weapons ask all of us to ponder and act. I think that, as the other speaker mentioned, it's really critical to refocus the debate on what the nuclear weapon use would mean for civilian and combatant, and for the natural environment on which all we depend. The existence of nuclear weapons poses some of the most profound questions about the extent of human suffering we are willing to inflict or to permit in war. And I think that if there is something you get out of this room, I would like that you take this one. What is the level of suffering that we are willing or permit in war? The entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is really an historic achievement. And I think that even it was not covered in the media so much because nuclear weapon states, they are not very interested and willing to join the treaty. I think that it's one of the most important treaties that been negotiated in the 20th century. It's an answer to a call made 5 decades ago by states that they concluded the treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to prevent the devastation that will be visited upon all mankind by a nuclear war. And then the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as mentioned, is a humanitarian disarmament treaty. And now I would like to say a few words. I am a mother of 4 young people. And you know, when I was in the negotiation, I always thought about the next generation. What kind of legacy we are bringing to the next generation? Your generation did nothing to cause the problem of nuclear weapon. You have been inherited from the previous one. And a solution to nuclear weapon required your imagination, your ambition, and the courage of your generation. You really need to be involved, to speak out, because, in case a nuclear weapon will be used, it's your generation who will bear the burden with the destruction of society as we know it. You know, the ICRC conducted a Millennium on War project in 2020, just before the COVID, with 16,000 young people in 16 countries. And 84% of millennials surveyed believe that the use of nuclear weapons is never acceptable. At the same time, almost half of the millennials believe that nuclear weapons are an effective instrument of deterrence. And I think that it's a very worrisome fact that millennium are nervous about their future, and 54% believe that it is likely that a nuclear attack will occur in the next decade, and it was prior the war in Ukraine. So I think that it's really quite amazing. So 3 takeaways and 1 ask. The 3 takeaways that I would like that you take is that the TPNW shows that the impossible is possible. Because before the negotiation, everybody thought that we were idealists or naive. But the treaty was negotiated, entered into force in 2021, and it's an historic achievement. What we cannot respond to, we must prevent. And we will not be able to respond to a nuclear weapon use. And then to refocus as I said, another spoke about, the nuclear weapon debate must ultimately be about people, about the fundamental rule of international humanitarian law, and about the collective future of humanity. And I think that we really need all together to support, to refocus the narrative. And 1 ask, please, as Seth mentioned, get engaged, muster the courage to speak out and act with determination and hope. Thank you.
So yes, apologies, I know that we're running out of time, so I'll ask our previous speakers to compress their presentations. So next we'll have Eduardo, who's the 3rd Secretary, expert on disarmament and non-proliferation affairs in the permanent mission of Mexico. We'll talk about the 2nd meeting of state parties.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers. I'm very happy to be here. I'll try to compress my remarks as much as possible because I think the engagement and the interactive part will be especially important today. So I am the team leader in the office of the president of the 2nd meeting of states parties, who is the ambassador of Mexico to the UN, Ambassador Juan Ramón de la Fuente. Why is Mexico part of this? So Mexico has a long-standing tradition on disarmament. This has been a priority for us for a long time, and even before the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Mexico was leader in creating the first nuclear weapon-free zone in a zone that is densely populated, Latin America, so the Tlatelolco Treaty. We were also very behind the NPT, but we've also been very interested in the issues of humanitarian disarmament. And this is one of those landmark treaties. So this is purely humanitarian, and Mexico was host of one of those preparatory meetings to the creation of the treaty, which is the Humanitarian Consequences Conferences. So Mexico is fully invested in this. We are very honored to be leading the 2nd meeting of states parties. So this is a meeting that will take place here in New York, the 27th of November to 1st December. Why New York? Because here you have the most representatives from countries. It's easier for everybody to be here, and we want it to be as inclusive as possible. Why is it important? So what you see there, the text of the treaty, everything that you've heard, how does that translate to actions? So we can say as much as we want, but then how is this implemented by those governments that are either committed or not so committed? What are those actions that happen? So that is why us diplomats like to invent the meetings of states parties, the review conferences, which means that all of that is in the text needs to happen physically with diplomats one way or another. But of course, leading a process like this is not easy, so that's why we have a great team of diplomats that are helping us in the different sections of the treaties. So you've heard from the co-chairs, there's also facilitators for different aspects of the treaty, but we also work closely with the ICRC and ICANN. This is a treaty that is all-encompassing. And having a meaningful impact cannot happen just in the vacuum, and even if we have great ideas, they need those specific actions and the burden sharing. So that is why we work with all of them very closely to be able to make sure that everything is on track. What are the priorities of our presidency? First of all, this is a very new treaty, so we want to make sure that everything is set accordingly. Maybe other treaties like the NPT have been long-standing and they have processes that are mostly tried out, but this is a new treaty. So we want to make sure that this treaty is set in the right way, that it's not just letters that have been written by diplomats. We also want to ensure that it becomes as universal as possible. So that is why one of the priorities is working with the co-chairs in that aspect. We want as many countries to be part of this treaty as possible. And we also want to follow up on the actions of the Vienna Action Plan. I'm grateful for my colleagues that have already mentioned some of those aspects. And as you've heard, there are many action points there. So how is that implemented in the day-to-day? It's not just agreeing amongst diplomats and negotiating a list. It means actions that have to be implemented. So as you see, this is a long-term goal. It cannot happen overnight. The elimination of nuclear weapons cannot happen that easily. And we want to be realistic. So there are some aspects that can be implemented a little bit more straightforwardly. Others require more engagement. Others require not only the governments, but also civil society. And as I said, the follow-up of those very specific issues of the Vienna Action Plan. Of course, there's frustration with the NPT, but at the same time, we feel that the TPNW is complementary to the NPT, but other instruments, the CTBT that you probably heard of, and also the nuclear weapon-free zones, amongst others. But the context of the second meeting of states parties also happens when there has been repeated failures of the NPT review conferences, a renewed spotlight on nuclear weapons use, as you've heard in Ukraine and such, but also very other positive aspects, such as the establishment of the Scientific Advisory Group, which you'll be hearing of, that creates then a different environment for the TPNW's second meeting of states parties. So as you see, we don't have an easy task ahead of us, but we will be leading that charge with the Mexican tradition. But before I conclude, I do want to say that do leave the thing of diplomats and governments to us. We will be doing that on our side. But I think that is an incomplete story. We require people like you to be able to follow up on all of this. It doesn't matter if governments are trying to decide one way or another, if they set their priorities one way or another. It is youth, and especially civil society, that have to make that change. And especially Mexico believes in education for disarmament and non-proliferation as one of the top priorities. So this is one event like today where we hope that we can get that engagement. It's not just the governments. And especially if you have any specific questions or ideas, please come forward with them and we will be very happy to take them. Thank you.
Next we have Dr. Ivana Hughes, who's the Senior Lecturer in the Discipline of Chemistry here at Columbia and President of the Nuclear HP. Here at Columbia and President of the Nuclear HP Foundation. And she will be talking about the role of the Scientific Advisory Group.
Thank you so much, Christian, and I am really absolutely trying to find my mouse. Where is it? Oh, found it. All right. Perfect. It's coming. I'm really absolutely delighted to be a part of this esteemed panel, to be here with dear friends and some current and former students. This is a really exciting event for me. Thank you, Eduardo, so much for mentioning the Scientific Advisory Group. What you have been hearing about is the working groups that the diplomats are working on, but there's oh, all right, you got it. To highlight 3 lessons from science that have informed the development of this treaty, but will continue to inform its implementation. And really, all three of these lessons have to do with what we've been talking about, are these humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And so I want to just say a couple of words about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You've heard, of course, you knew very well before even coming into this room. You've heard some of the numbers about the number of people dying. So in Hiroshima, according to some estimates, even over 150,000 people died in a city of 250,000 people. So that's 60% of the population. And of course, it's also known that those impacts have been lingering, have continued. People are being treated at the Red Cross Hospital in Hiroshima to this day for cancer and other ailments related to the exposure. What is far less known is the way in which radiation exposure affects people differently. And it affects people differently based upon age, and it turns out based upon gender as well. And so what we're looking at here is the way in which age, a time of exposure to radiation, impacts your increased risk of getting cancer later on in life. And basically, without sort of going through the details of what you're seeing here, is a female infant is twice as likely to get cancer later on in life if they're exposed to a certain amount of radiation at age 0. And that amount actually turns out to be about 20 times higher than the risk of cancer for a male who is exposed to the same amount of radiation at age 30. So these are really, these are very, very discriminate impacts, and these lessons are important to keep in mind as we continue to work on a world free of nuclear weapons. The second point I want to make is about nuclear testing. You've heard from Ambassador Sito about the stories from Kiribati, and you've heard from Jean Geldi about stories from Kazakhstan. The picture of nuclear testing, and I know it's hard to see, but this is essentially showing you all of the many places around the world that were impacted by nuclear testing, really decades of nuclear testing. And of course, I'll highlight the Pacific, where Kiribati is. So this screen doesn't work with my laser pointer. But in the middle, the blue lines in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the blue dots, there are two there for Marshall Islands, where the United States tested nuclear weapons. And then there are the blue and pink dots where the US and the UK tested nuclear weapons in Kiribati. That's just a little south and east of the Marshall Islands. In the Marshall Islands, it was actually two atolls, Bikini and Enewetak. And I just want to give you a sense that these impacts continue to today. So in the Marshall Islands, the US tested the equivalent of 7,000 Hiroshima bombs over a period of 12 years that ended in 1958, so almost 65 years ago. And to this day, the radiation remains. So this is a map of Bikini Atoll. These are data obtained by Columbia University students such as yourselves several years ago. And in Bikini Atoll, what we're finding is levels of something called external gamma radiation. So that's walking around the place, how much external gamma radiation are you being exposed to? Those levels are very, very high, far above any of the limits, accepted limits. And in parts of, essentially, the US has a limit for civilians of 15 milligrams per year for external gamma radiation. That would be like the purple, and there's no purple on this map anywhere. Another, just as an example, and this is actually even more troublesome, more dangerous, is when the radiation gets into the food. And in Bikini, what we did is we tested levels of radiation in the fruit and compared them to different limits that actually different countries and organizations keep as limits for this particular isotope. It's called cesium-137 in the food. The 0 to 40, that's essentially Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine after the experience of Chernobyl set 40 as the limit for this particular isotope in infant food. And then other limits were set by other countries. The US has by far the highest limit. It's 1200, and you can tell, far higher than 40. And in Bikini, we found no fruits that would satisfy the infant food limit of those 3 countries I mentioned, and we found any fruits that violated even the US limit. So that just gives you a sense that this radiation is still there 65 years later. You heard a little bit about nuclear winter, and I'll just show you the numbers. I'll just refer to the numbers that Seth was talking about. So again, the soot goes out into the atmosphere, it blocks incoming sunlight. The temperatures around the globe drop down by about 15 degrees Celsius. That means the average temperature on Earth is 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It is freezing everywhere. And you can imagine that food is not growing. And this is a very fast effect. This is happening very, very quickly. Within 2 years, the idea is that the billions of people that Seth was mentioning would die. And I'll just point out the 2 scenarios that Seth was referring to. So this middle one, at 37 teragrams of soot. So that's the assumption about the number of bombs used. We're looking at 127 million people dying directly from the attacks, right? So hundreds of millions dead by the attacks. But it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you are in South Africa or in Malaysia or in Canada. Actually, Canada will be even worse because, you know, it's cold and it's only going to get colder, right? It's over 2 billion people dying. And the worst scenario where the US and Russia use 1/3 of their arsenals, 360 million deaths from direct casualties from the attacks, and over 5.4 billion people dying from starvation. So I just want to end on nuclear zero is possible. It is possible because of this treaty. It is possible because of the people in this room, and it is possible because people like you are going to get involved. So let me know if you want to get on the train. It's really, really important work. And again, I'm delighted to be here with everyone tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for, we have one more speaker, I promise. I thank you all for staying over an hour with us. I think we greatly appreciate it when it's been a very long event. More than an hour, but thank you so much. Our final speaker is Mr. Jorge Ugan, who is the first secretary from Prohibition Chile. And Chile represents the gender focal point of the team.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I will be brief. So first of all, the report of the first meeting of state parties to the TPNW, it was decided that Chile be appointed gender focal point to work during the intersessional period to support the implementation of the gender provision of the treaty and report on progress made to the second meeting of state parties in November, as said Eduardo. The TPNW is a unique example of a weapons of mass destruction related disarmament instrument that includes specific gender considerations and obligations. In the preamble to the treaty, it is recognized that the equal, full, and effective participation of both women and men is an essential factor for the promotion and attainment of sustainable peace and security, and commits to supporting and strengthening the effective participation of women in nuclear disarmament. Also, in the preamble, it is acknowledged that nuclear weapons have a disproportionate impact on women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation and the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons activities on indigenous peoples is recognized. So, another thing, by underscoring the disproportionate impact on indigenous peoples, the treaty also outlines avenues for addressing diversity within gender groups and for examining how gender intersects with other social aspects, including ethnicity, race, and age. So, the TPNW has a critical moment. So for this reason, it's very important to try to work together in guidelines, voluntary reporting, national assessment, and national action plans that include, of course, gender. International cooperation can play an important role too. One thing very important that is as I said before, ionizing radiation is harmful to living cells. Harm is greater when children are exposed compared to adults. This is no reflection from my side, so it's the scientific advisor that say this, but I think this is important. For this reason, we have a gender group that work this. At any age, radiation is more harmful to females than to males. Young girls are most harmed by radiation measured as cancer across their lifetime. So, as my colleague said before, education is very important. Well, as Eduardo said, very clear. One reason of we are here is for education, and we have had a different group to share ideas about gender. And in the last Tuesday, I think it was our last session, Mrs. Mrs. Mary Olson, that is co-director of Gender and Radiation Impact Project, she shared some numbers about this issue. Okay, thank you so much.
So much, Jorge. So, running out of time, but we have maybe a few minutes for some quick Q&A, in case you have any questions that you would like to ask our panelists. Don't be shy. Yes, I was shy.
Sure. Thank you so much for everyone who spoke. I know that Trump and Biden were both very critical of the TPNW as it was coming out, and I was wondering if anybody could speak to what it's like engaging with nuclear-armed countries at the UN specifically.
I'd like to take that. Maybe we can start with
Okay, I'll speak from here. Thank you for that question, it's very good. Particularly because of the pressure that's always exerted on countries that are trying to do something that is, morally right and actually strategically the ideas that they rely on really doesn't make any sense. is that we believe we're on the right side of history, and that it's only through the sort of momentum that we gain from gathering, as many as possible for the treaty that we will be able to overcome this. Yeah, we don't believe in the logic of deterrence. Deterrence makes no sense. I mean, there's very little leg to stand on the humanitarian aspects of nuclear weapons. So the fact that they are holding on to this sacred cow of something that's actually destructive to all of humanity is something that they will have to deal with in their conscience. So we really feel that we're on the right side of history, and so that sort of propels us through the pressure. And I think yeah, hopefully we'll realize it soon.
Sorry, if I can add, Christian? Thanks. I think that's a fantastic question, because you're hearing from a very close-knit group of states here who are all on the same page, right? But you asked how it is for us to engage with the likes of the US, the weapon states. It certainly is challenging, and the NPT context is that's one platform where you have the 5 nuclear weapon states and everyone else being a non-nuclear weapon state. And again, going back to the grand bargain, what it means, what the nuclear weapon states are obliged to do, how far they've kept up their share of that deal, as it were. And that's why the negotiations are often painstaking. Next week, in fact, we'll have the UN disarmament commission session, and that covers all UN member states. So again, it's extremely challenging when it comes to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Going back to what Yes also said about doctrines like strategic stability, deterrence, and we're starting often from diametrically opposed perspectives. But that is why it is so important for us as DPW states parties to continue to coordinate. We have heard during the NPT review conference last year many delegations with the leadership of the outgoing president, the incoming president, and others made it a point to stress that the DPW does not detract in any way from the NPT. It is complementary to it. But that process is challenging, and yeah, as others have said, it only underlines the need for us to keep building public support for it with a view to finally achieving all those
Thank you so much. Next, I know Seth would like to comment.
Sure, yes. I mean, it is a very pointed question. You asked specifically about the United States. I feel like I must answer as a United States citizen in addition to my capacity working with civil society. But before I do, I think I should note that the U.S. is not alone, as has been said, in opposing this treaty. All the possessor states and their nuclear complicit allies are the problem here. And they've each exerted their influences in really insidious ways, I should say, like, in these sort of, in a way that speaks to the whole trajectory of this treaty and the impetus that we have to correct the harms that have been done socioeconomically and politically as well. I mean, by which I mean, like, these states are operating in their colonial spheres of influence. Like, France works on the Francophone states, and the UK works on, the former UK colonies, and Russia works in states that are in their influence. These are really things that we react to in civil society as injustice. Now, the U.S., okay. To Yassine's point about us knowing that we're on the right side, we can already see progress being made in terms of changing the way the administrations react to this treaty. Again, you never expect the possessor states to lead this way or be on the right side of the treaty. But as the rest of the world gets behind it, you can see how it's changing. In the early stages, under the Obama administration, and we saw strong opposition to the treaty coming about, to it being even negotiated. Then enter Trump, and we saw very pointed work. In fact, some of the most egregious, I would say, actions in international affairs to even say the Trump administration went so far as to send letters to countries that had ratified the treaty, telling them to unratify the treaty in a way that, I think has kind of never happened before or since. Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, on the day that the treaty was adopted, stood outside the hall and spoke. She said, as a mother, as a woman, she said that the states that were in that room negotiating this treaty were acting irresponsibly, and that speaking on the P3, speaking for the U.S., France, and the UK, said that they weren't going to join this treaty, but they went a step further. They said they would never join the treaty, and I think that's where they tip their hand to the work that we're doing and the way it's right, because who in these ostensibly democratic countries can dare to speak on behalf of future generations and say never? That to me should actually, perhaps more than anything, show that we were on the right track, because they know how much it's actually is the future. I think they were tipping their hand in a way that overplaying their hand as such. And now we have this new administration, and we have seen actually the disarmament people in the State Department have said that they will stop asking states not to join the treaty, that they will stop pressuring. So I think that's already progress. I mean, it's incremental, but we can see that we're going in the right direction, and I think that's huge for what we're aiming to achieve. And so I have great hope that my country, with the work of civil society, will come around fully eventually. And we've seen it again in the past. We've seen how the nuclear freeze movement in the 80s was, a million people in Central Park. We've seen what civil society has done to, in these democratic countries especially, to tell their government what they must do and to see how the government eventually does respond. The only question, I think, whether we get the U.S. and other countries to fully join is it going to be before a great tragedy or after? And with our work, I think we can hopefully do that.
Yes, thank you, Seth. Next, Warren.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, just to subscribe most of what my colleagues have said, I just want to say that we as diplomats, our job is to engage. So we cannot just stand back and just say this is our treaty and that is it. Our job is to be able to open those channels of communication to others. Even if you don't see eye to eye, the communication can never be lost. And you need to be able to build this to at times understand a little bit better the other side. So if you only speak with the discourse that's been brought by your government, you will not be able to really understand what comes after. But just talking about nuclear weapons as a theoretical issue doesn't go into the issue of how these weapons would affect people, what are the scientific issues behind it. If you start to be able to communicate that intelligently, there's a possibility of changing those lines. The NPT that now everybody claims to be one of the greatest treaties ever in the terms of the nuclear field, just to point out that not all countries that have signed on to it were behind it at one point. Even some of the nuclear countries said that they would not sign the treaty. So it doesn't mean that this is a static picture of the moment. There's a possibility of change. And then I keep on coming back to the issue of civil society. It's the need to challenge the status quo. So we're all told about the necessity of nuclear weapons to maintain security, but nobody ever questions that. And some just leave it to the governments to have those decisions. But it has to come from the people to change that. And even if there's countries that have nuclear weapons and their policy is to keep them, just like Seth said, there are cities that have signed on to the opposite. So if there's a critical mass against nuclear weapons, that can be the change for the governments. But the key question is to never stop engaging and to have that diplomatic communication.
Thank you. Please.
So I love that you asked this question, and even though I'm not a diplomat, I'm going to answer it because I have an article, an op-ed coming out in the Hill tomorrow at 12:30. So check the Hill homepage, in which I actually discuss another historical example, which is the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty, or the Partial Test Ban Treaty. which Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated in 13 days in 1963 after they had gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis and thought that they were going to destroy the whole world. The DC establishment was not going to have any of this. Ending atmospheric testing was not on any of the senators' agenda. They were not interested. And Kennedy went into a full core press campaign for public support. And within 2 months, the senators, one by one, 80 to 19 ratification vote. I'm not saying we're going to get there now with this treaty, but that's the model. We do need the general public to stand behind this issue, and that's called public salience, and then you get political salience after you have public salience. So there is hope. The one interesting thing which I talked about in the article is that Pope John XIII actually played a very significant role, both directly and behind the scenes, in negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev. And so I think there's some room here for people at that level, including Pope Francis, to get involved and start to get these countries to talk about this.
So much. Any other questions? So before we conclude, I know we have that's the first question. Anastasia is actually an intern for the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and she's also with Reverse and Trend. She would like to talk about very briefly how all people get involved with our youth initiative called Reverse and Trend. Say what people say that.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming. Despite my pointed question, I do work for the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, so I am in full support of this work. And we've heard a lot of encouragement for youth advocacy and youth engagement in this movement. So if anybody's interested in joining the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation or just learning more about what we do, please come talk to me afterwards, or if you have to go, no worries. I can write my email up on this whiteboard, and you can reach out to me at any time. We also have Instagram. I will also include it on the board.
And we also have a brochure as well.
Yeah, and brochures next to the door. Thank you, and please get as much food as you want. It's all there for you. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending. Apologies that we went over the time, but thank you all for staying. And as Anastasia mentioned, there is information in the back next to the sandwiches about how you can join our youth initiative for Reverse and Trend. So thank you all.